The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1916, Chapter 18, Part 2. The Progressives were people who were trying to make things, of course, better, and they acted out of these particular characteristics. They were acting out of concern because they had a fundamental optimism about the human nature. And also, the biggest thing is they were willing to intervene in people's lives. So if you didn't want to change, sometimes they fixed it so you had to change. And they turned more and more to the authority of the state and federal government to help them enforce this. Because their one desire was to purge the world of sins. And they believed in progress and they hated waste. So they got together and they kind of joined forces. It wasn't just one group. It was people in Chicago and New York and Atlanta. I mean, there were people all over the country that were going to join forces. And they would share information and form organizations. And some of them were good. They started having professional organizations of lawyers and of medicine, of religion and business, and teaching and social workers. If we have an organization where these people are professionals, they're going to be able to do a better job. Of course, it began in the larger cities, and some of the leading crusaders were the Women's Christian Temperance Union, yes, and the 18th Amendment. The women's movement, well, it had many starts and stops, but it started after the Civil War. And the indecision by the women's groups whether to seek state or federal legislation. The National American Women's Society and the American Women's Society, they merged into the National Women's Society of America and helped get the 19th Amendment passed, which let the women vote. And it was a social movement, and most successful of the state laws they got done was to limit women's working hours, because prior to this time, you could work 8 or 14 hours a day, but most times you've always worked 10 to 12 hours. They also, unfortunately, had the child labor laws overturned because the courts decided that the government was interfering in parental concerns. They lobbied for government-sponsored reforms, and the progressives believed the experts could solve the problems. As a result, of course, as much as I hate to say it, there are a lot of other government agencies formed. And once you form a government agency, it never goes away. See, prior to this time, there had been really no standards in the medical field. There were some people who went to medical school and became good doctors, but there were some people who just put the word doctor in front of their name, and they were quacks with no medical training at all. They were out to basically take your money. And the biggest problem was they had the right to tell people how to care for their bodies, and they seemed to focus on women. Women had no sense. They didn't know how to take care of themselves, so doctors, men, usually do this. Then, of course, we've got the birth control movement. And it's quite a controversy between the social aspect of it and the religious aspect. There were devout Christians who were opposed because it violated God's law to go out and, procreate the world. And they were overseers of the moral behavior. They opposed anything to deal with limiting the number of children you could have because it's going to foster promiscuity. That's the same argument they used about putting condoms in public places. Theodore Roosevelt, our president, opposed it. He said it's going to mean the race death because once a woman has one child, she'll never have another one. And if you just have a husband and wife have one child, you're going to have negative population growth. The Comstock Act was named after a man named Comstock who was an ultra Puritan, and he had seen some things during the Civil War that he thought were not nice, and women, associating with men in the bad way. And so he managed to get information that contained anything about birth control or sex banned from the mails. By 1914, 22 states had laws that hindered giving information. Even a doctor couldn't give you information other than sleep on the roof. Then the much-loved and much-feared Emma Goldman, she was an anarchist. She was a Russian. She was also a socialist, bordering on communism. And she stirred up a lot of women. And, of course, we all have heard of Margaret Sanger, and she has been condemned and damned and misunderstood in a lot of ways. In reality, she was born from a large Catholic family. She was one of 10, born in 1879, and she had a father who, although he was a big drinker, he seemed to believe in his children should learn how to do something, be educated. She went to college. I don't know how she managed to do it by working. She put herself through college, and she became a nurse. And she did the normal thing. She got married and had 3 children. Then she got a little bored with herself and didn't like what she was seeing in society. So she moved to Greenwich Village, which at this time was the place to be. And especially if you wanted to make changes, it was full of radicals and poets and all kinds of crazy people. And she began to socialize with the radicals, and she joined the Women's Committee of New York Socialist Party, and she supported the International Women's Workers for Strikes. She even wrote a newspaper column called Whatever Girls Should Know. It was banned because she was telling people how to take care of their body, or women, how to take care of their bodies and how to maybe prevent a pregnancy. And then she saw a woman die of a self-induced abortion. She had gone to the doctor to try to have him do something to prevent another pregnancy because she had 5 children and she just couldn't take care of it anymore. So when she got pregnant, she went to the doctor and he said, no, we don't do abortions. It's against the law. So she self-induced, and we won't go into details of what she did to make herself abort, but she ended up puncturing her uterus and bled to death. And Margaret Sanger sat there and watched her die because she'd been told to prevent a pregnancy, have your husband sleep on the roof. So she began studying about contraceptives. And in 1914, she wrote a journal entitled Women Rebel. And she gave birth control information, but it only was allowed to publish 7 issues because it broke the Comstock law. So, a warrant was issued for her arrest, and she fled the country and went to England. And when she got over there, she learned that they were a little bit more open about it, and she also came to believe that, birth control shouldn't be a legal issue. It's not a social issue. It's a medical issue between a woman and her doctor. So she returned to the U.S. in 1916, and meanwhile the government's occupied with World War I. So she opened a birth control clinic in Brooklyn. Well, it was raided, and she spent 30 days in jail. The New York Court of Appeals upheld the sentence, but did rule a physician should have discretion in prescribing birth control. So it was one step forward and one step backwards. Late in 1916, she formed the New York Birth Control League and pushed for laws to make doctors able to give information. But eugenics saw ways to control the undesirables through this. 1921, the Nationwide American Birth Control League was formed. In 1940, Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, came out in support of family planning, which I think is a much nicer ring than birth control, family planning. And now, did she actually say more children for the fit, less children for the unfit? Yes. It only makes sense. If you have a baby every year, your body's going to be so tired, you're not going to be able to take care of them. And if your husband gets killed or has to go to war or something, and you're alone taking care of 10 or 12 kids, the kids are not going to be taken care of. They're not going to be educated. So basically what she was saying was, if you're healthy and good shape and got some money, it's okay to have as many kids as you want. But if you're not working and you're poor and you're living in a shack, kind of take care and don't have as many children. In 1966, we had the first birth control pill approved by the FDA. So it was in the middle of the 20th century before American women could be educated on family planning. Prior to this time, you had to use the Catholic method, or what is it called? You can only have sex a certain time of the month. I'll think about it in a few minutes. And condoms were around, but they were used basically to prevent a man from getting an STU. But STU, that's not right. Prevent a man from getting a disease. Meanwhile, we've even got some Native Americans are making progress. They formed some societies that had shared some goals. They wanted to transform the communal lands to family farms. And then Mexican, Carlos Montezuma, the critic, he condemned the idea. He demanded the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and called for self-determination and full citizenship for all American Mexicans. But progressivism was a worldwide movement. In 1900, the 12 cities in Europe and the U.S. had more than 1 million members. And here again, the reformers are exchanging ideas back and forth in France and Britain and Germany. And Germany was going to lead the way. Minimum wage laws, old age pensions, unemployment insurance, regulation of work safety. Oh, man, this was great. The American reformers wanted social legislation for the law to make it a law so we can punish you if you don't do it. But the most progressive reforms were at local and state level. And they had 4 basic goals, basically, for your local towns and cities. They wanted to reduce the power of the political bosses in the towns. They wanted public control over the public works. That makes sense. And they also wanted to improve public transportation. And they wanted to raise taxes for school, parks, and public facilities. Improve the infrastructure, right? And then Robert M. La Follette. Oh, he's quite a dude. He was a governor of Wisconsin in 1900, and when he left that, he became a Republican congressman. But he made Wisconsin what we call a laboratory for democracy. And the Wisconsin idea began to spread around. It was an idea where you'd have a primary, that's not supposed to be elections and not elations, taxations on corporations and the wealthy, state regulation of railroad and public utilities. Actually, he became a socialist. 17th Amendment was finally passed, so we finally could elect our own senators. It wasn't done by the local legislatures. Prior to this time, we had voted for electors who voted for the senators. Some states even adopted the initiative and the referendum recall, California being one, Wisconsin being one. But some reforms were going to restrict democracy because they disenfranchised the blacks in the South. Some elected mayors were replaced by appointed commissioners or city managers, and I lived in a town where we had a city manager instead of an elected governor. New literacy tests for voting, residency tests for voting, registration requirements to vote. So although we're eliminating the black vote, we're also eliminating the poor white vote. Progressives were a little bit leery of politics. There'd been so much lobbying going on, and they weren't happy with the things the government was doing, so they actually turned to professional experts and college professors who were experts in the field that they wanted to change. They wanted central management. A man named Walter Lippmann, famous historian and socialist, wrote Drift and Mastery. He said political freedom should be in the hands of the most qualified, not by popular vote. That gets a little scary, doesn't it? Political freedom should be in the hands of the most qualified, not by popular vote. But then who decides is the most qualified? It's kind of like censorship. Women were central to the progressive politics, especially the upper class women. They challenged the barriers and the grassroots vision of a government interested in helping immigrants, women, and children workers. Enter Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams was, well, she's not quite as severe as she looked. She was a good woman. I mean, she's very upper class, led a very sheltered life. But back in this time when she was born, they had what they call grand tours of Europe. If you were a man, after you got out of college, you would spend about a year touring Europe and visiting the brothels and sowing your wild oats, so to speak, and then you'd come back to the States and you'd get married and settle down. Now, for a woman, she would have a grand tour, but what she would do would be go to the libraries, go to the opera houses, and go to more classical things. So when she was over in England, she saw poverty. She, first time she'd ever seen it. And she visited a place called Tonnevie Hall in London. And it was a place that took care of immigrants and women. So when she returned to Chicago with a lady friend called Ellen Starr, she founded something called Hull House. Now, I have never married there. She never got married. She and Ellen Starr were significant others. This is the Hull House that she bought, and this is a picture of the nursery that she had for the immigrant women to bring their children there while they learned how to read and write and do things. A staff member greets an immigrant family at Hull House. See, she's got 3 children. Chances are she's probably pregnant with another one. Mothers with baby carriage wait outside to get in. Here's an older Addams and an older Ellen Starr. But now we also have this group of new women coming along. They're college educated, and they're finally learned something to do beside ride a side saddle and play the piano. They're learning how to be a nurse or how to work with people to help them. And they're getting an education in math and history and things, and it's really great. But the middle class wanted to help the poor working woman, usually an immigrant. And they learned the necessity for the legislation because sometimes they would go to help these people. There were immigrants that, living in a one-room shack, and she didn't know how to cook American foods or how to budget her money or anything, and they'd try to help. But they were resisted because mother did it this way, grandmother did this way, the family's always done it this way, and they wouldn't change. Well, you take more than one bath a week, well, you're going to wash all the oils out of your skin and your skin will peel off. What do you mean wash your hair once a week or once every this is just ridiculous. Shorter work hours is one of the things they were working for, because that and workplace safety. Be trained on how to use these machines, for instance, before you start working on one of these machines. But in the South, unfortunately, the blacks did not benefit. Julia Lathrop formed a children's bureau in 1912 to try to keep children under age of 16 from working. Lawrence Kelly formed something called the National Consumer League, trying to get standardized prices and fair prices for products. Women did win the vote in Wyoming and Colorado and Idaho and Utah, but they were basically local elections. You couldn't vote in the federal election. Between 1914 and 1919, 7 more states are going to allow women to vote in local elections. But this domestic role inspired the suffrage movement. Would the state protect women and children, or should they even? Should we have a pension for mothers even though she hasn't been working? Should we have materialistic reforms to help the woman who stays home? Should we encourage women to bear and raise more children if they have the ability and are economically independent? Laws benefit, yet so many of these new laws that were coming out and movements that were coming out were really restricting the woman to the family role of home. 1908, the Supreme Court ruled that the long hours of work was dangerous for women. Now, that was a protective law. It benefited and tied women to the family role. A man named Brandeis said the right to a decent home and protection came from being a citizen. So the idea of universal entitlements and protection was put forth, but it wasn't until the 1930s, during the Great Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal, would entitlements become a reality. But nationalization is occurring because large corporations are dominating the economy. And they've got the American Medical Association that's beginning to insist that you go to college before you can become a doctor. There was even sports leagues developed. So the era of Jeffersonian of self-determination is going to come to an end, and individual freedom gotten by the government intervention in the economy, which was what Hamilton wanted. There's my boy, Teddy Roosevelt. Quite the dude. If I could meet any of my former presidents, this is the one I would really like to meet. He was what we call a progressive era president. He was the youngest president. He wasn't the youngest president elected. That would be Kennedy, but he was very young when he inherited the office from McKinley when he was assassinated. He believed that the president should be very active and involved in foreign politics and be daring and forward. And he set an agenda. He called his agenda, if you would, the square deal. And he was known for busting trusts, but his predecessor, Taft, is going to bust more trusts than he did. He thoroughly believed the president should help settle labor disputes. And in 1903, he threatened the union workers if they didn't end their strike, he was going to bring the military in to do the farming. I mean, not the farming, but the coal mining. So the labor union leaders were livid, but he got the strike settled. So even though he took over McKinley's term and ran the whole term, it was, I think, 3.5 years, he hadn't been elected. So when he ran for re-election in 1904, it was his first term to be elected, and he did win. He wanted economic regulations, and he got the Hepburn Act passed, which is the International Commerce Commission, but unfortunately, they didn't enforce it. He called for inheritance and income tax and business regulations, especially on the wealthy. But he was an avid outdoorsman. He loved going hunting. He's led the world in conserving the wilderness areas, and we can thank him for really having a lot of national parks. For instance, the Yellowstone National Park ordered millions of acres to be set aside in 1872 for the people of the country to enjoy. He wanted experts to help control national resources, control the water in the West. But his successor in 1908, which was handpicked by him, he didn't do a very good job. There's William Howard Taft. He's the fat one that went to the Philippines to govern and help bring them out of ignorance and poverty. The former federal judge from Ohio, the former governor of the Philippines, ran against William Jennings Bryan, and he believed should go beyond laissez-faire and government hands-off. He did pursue the antitrust busters, and Rockefeller Standard Oil Corporation and the American Tobacco Company both were victims of his busting. He supported the 16th Amendment, which was graduated income tax, but unfortunately he began to ally with the conservative wing of the party instead of the progressive wing, which really upset Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt's unhappy with Taft, to put it mildly. So when Taft was going to run for his second term, Teddy had tried to get the party to nominate him, but they weren't going to nominate someone from who wasn't the sitting president. So he formed his own party called the Bull Moose Party, and all that did was split the party right down the middle. There was a four-way race with William Taft, a conservative sitting president. Eugene Debs supported socialist reforms and public ownership of railroad and banks, unemployment assistance, and laws setting minimum wages. He was the populist candidate. Teddy Roosevelt, forming his own party, even though he was a Republican, he said it was necessary to preserve individual freedoms and increase government powers. Now, then you had this man from the Northeast, New Jersey. He'd been a governor. He'd been a governor, yes, but he'd also been the president of a college. He believed in the necessity of government to preserve freedoms, but with less government powers, and he is a Democrat. So you've got Theodore Roosevelt and Taft splitting the Republican Party. You've got Eugene Debs, who is the populist socialist candidate, and it just opened the way for the Democrats to take over. There's Woodrow Wilson. He looks like he's been sucking on the lemon, and I think he had. His program was called The New Freedom. Less government business, free of government interference. Strengthen the antitrust laws and enforce them. Protect the workers' rights to form unions and encourage small businesses to start. He wanted to create an economic competition with government regulating of economy. Government hands off, laissez-faire. Now, this was what he was preaching when he was running for the presidency. He did not always follow through on his promises. Roosevelt's proposed program was called New Nationalism, and he accepted bigness and strong government regulations. He wanted a heavy personal tax on the rich and corporations. He wanted federal regulation of industries to keep from having monopolies. He wanted a women's suffrage vote and an 8-hour day for the women to work and a living wage. He also wanted something called national insurance and unemployment. Now, this doesn't sound like Republican ideas. It sounds more like Democratic ideas in the later part of the 20th century, but at the time, this is what he was believing. As you can see, all those states voted Democratic. You've got one progressive state, which is New York. You've got one Republican socialist state, which is what, Utah? I mean, Wilson just walked away with it. So Wilson wins the election. He becomes a very strong president. He becomes the first president to hold regularly scheduled press conferences and the first president since Thomas Jefferson to deliver messages to Congress in person. He passed the Underwood Tariff, which reduces some of the taxes and the tariffs. He got the Clayton Act of 1914, which exempted unions from antitrust and limited a worker's right to strike. So we had that, one forward, one backward step. It outlawed child labor and limited the railroad work to 8 hours. Allowed credit to farmers for warehouse stored crops. Remember, they were talking about that when they formed the Progressive Party. They wanted, if they had a surplus of the crop this year and there was too much of it already on sale, to store it and let the government give them a loan. That's what they got. It pushed Congress to create something called the Federal Reserve System in 1913. And in 1916, the era had vastly increased the powers of the national state. So we're going to end at Chapter 18 on progressivism, and next Monday we will start World War I. But this is a little segment, and like I say, it is not John Green. Doris Kearns, what's her last name? Anyway, she's going to tell you what her last name is. I read a couple of her books. She's going to explain progressivism and Roosevelt and Taft. It's just a couple of minutes, about 5 minutes long, I think. About as if it ever comes up. And like I say, we'll spend more time on President Wilson during World War II. One. Like I said, I'm beginning to hate dots that move around, even if they're not blue. I'm going to It's wiggling. I think it's getting ready to do something. Goodwin. Doris Kearns Goodwin. That was her name. Or is still her name.
Hello, this is Doris Kearns Goodwin, and this is History in 5, and I'm going to tell you about Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Progressive Era. Before the Progressive Era, we had this huge gap between the rich and the poor, women working in factories, maximum hours not even cared about, no workman's compensation, and nothing was being done about it. And then suddenly comes a movement from the society, led in part by Theodore Roosevelt, helped by these muckraking journalists, to decide that government has to have a role in dealing with the social and economic problems of the age. So as a result, it was a really optimistic, heady time. It was, as a later Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, later said, one of those generations that had a rendezvous with destiny. That's what it felt like. If I could have lived in one of those times, I'd be back in that Progressive era. The most important part, I think, of Teddy Roosevelt's leadership was his ability to communicate with his countrymen. He knew how to speak in a language that they understood. He sometimes said that sometimes my Harvard people might think I'm a little folksy in my language and that I'm not sophisticated enough, but I know how to reach the emotions of the people. And he took these huge train trips around the country for months at a time, where he would stop at every village station and talk to the people, repeating his mission over and over again. And then, most importantly, he had the most remarkable set of relationships with the press. He's the one who defined the bully pulpit, meaning the national platform the president has to mobilize public sentiment and to bring to bear pressure from the outside to force a reluctant Congress to do what it may not want to do. Even when he was having his shaving hour at the White House, he would allow the press to come in and they could ask questions while the barber was trying to shave him. Among the people in the press, none were more important to the Progressive Era than a group at a magazine called McClure's, founded by Sam McClure, this fabulous, manic-depressive, really interesting character, who gave his staff, including Ida Tarbell, Ray Baker, William Allen White, and Lincoln Steffens, legendary names in the history of journalism, sometimes 2 years to research their projects so that they could come up with stories that could mobilize public sentiment. Ida Tarbell writing about Standard Oil. So stunning were her revelations of the unfair uses that Standard Oil had made in order to become a monopoly that it led to the antitrust suit against Standard Oil. And Lincoln Steffens writing about the corruption in the city led to the toppling of a lot of old bosses, people sent to jail, and reform mayors coming in. And together they formed a camaraderie that was unlike any they had ever had before. And they looked back on this time years later, 2 decades, 3 decades later, as the most fulfilling time of their lives because they felt they had a mission and a call to change America, and they did. History has known so very little about Taft, mostly only that he followed Teddy Roosevelt and was president, and then Teddy came back from Africa, ran against him, and that they had a very ugly campaign against one another. But the story is much more complex and I think more interesting. They'd had a long friendship, 400 letters written over time, over 2 decades. Taft was handpicked by Teddy Roosevelt to be his successor. Teddy actually ran his campaign, telling him, fight, do this, be more like me. But then he felt that Taft had disappointed him in not being as progressive as he was supposed to be, and he decided then to run against him in 1912. The issues that were part of the industrial era led to a rift in the Republican Party, a split between the progressive wing and the more established conservative wing that again, once again, history comes full round. We're seeing a split in the Republican Party now that is being called a civil war, which actually was taking place in 1912. And I suppose the cautionary tale for the current Republican Party is when that split took place, before it took place, Roosevelt was able to contain both wings and get a lot done, win an election, keep the Republicans in majority. Once the split widened and he formed the third party, the Bull Moose Party, then both he and Taft and both wings of the Republican Party lost that election, lost the Congress, lost the Senate. So it should tell the current Republican Party that it's sometimes healthy to have dissent within your party, but when it ruptures to the point where you're yelling at one another and really threatening to leave, then history suggests that it's a tough time for that party.
This young lady, Doris Kearns Goodwin, she's written several biographies of presidents and important political figures. And she spent a whole year with Lyndon Baines Johnson after he left office in his ranch in Texas and interviewing him to write the book on him. So she's a great writer. She really is. If you ever get a chance to read anything she's written, you will enjoy it. And like I said, we'll spend more time on President Wilson in the next segment. I will remind you, don't forget to do your test. It's due by 11:30 Sunday night because Monday we begin World War I. Well, if I can get it to stop.